Douglas thought he had planned everything: the forged documents, the poisoned tea, the perfect accident. But Marion Whitmore, his 67-year-old wife, wasn't just fading into frailty. She was watching, documenting, and building a case, one that would take him down long after she took her last breath. Douglas and Marianne Whitmore lived in a quiet cul-de-sac in the suburbs of Augusta, Georgia. Their two-story brick home, with its blue shutters and tidy front lawn, looked like the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. To outsiders, they were the kind of couple that simply blended into the scenery. Douglas, at 72, was a retired financial advisor who had once run a small consultancy firm. He liked to tell people he had helped dozens retire in comfort. Marianne, 5 years younger, had spent most of her adult life as a high school librarian. Her days were filled with books, lesson plans, and gentle conversations with teenagers about homework and future dreams. When she retired, she filled her time with gardening, volunteering at the church thrift shop, and baking for neighbors. For more than 4 decades, Douglas and Marianne appeared to have a solid marriage. They had no children, no scandal, no drama. Their lives rolled forward with the gentle predictability of routine: grocery runs on Wednesdays, church on Sundays, dinner at the same diner on Friday nights. Their financial life seemed stable. Douglas still played the role of the money man, managing their investments, bills, and insurance. Marianne, always the more cautious one, had a minor stroke 2 years before her death. Since then, her pace slowed. She had begun to rely on a cane, and her energy dwindled. She brushed off most of the changes, blaming them on age, but something in her eyes had changed. She didn't smile as often. She didn't seem quite as present, people around her noticed. Sandra Nichols, their next-door neighbor and one of Marianne's oldest friends, often visited for tea. Lately, Marianne seemed forgetful, disoriented. She once told Sandra the same story 3 times in an hour. Another day, she showed up at Sandra's house in her robe, confused about what time it was. Sandra gently suggested she see a doctor. Again, but Marianne just laughed and said she probably needed more sleep. Douglas, however, didn't seem worried. When Sandra brought up her concerns, he shrugged them off. He said Marianne had become paranoid and overly emotional since the stroke. He even joked that she was starting to think he was trying to poison her because he made her tea in the morning. But Sandra never found it funny. There was something behind Douglas's smile, something distant and calculating. Within 6 months of that conversation, Marianne began declining rapidly. She stopped going to church, citing fatigue. She stopped baking. The garden outside wilted from neglect. When Sandra offered to take her to the doctor, Douglas always had a reason to say no. He told friends they were managing things privately, that doctors weren't much help at this point. He painted Marianne's condition as a slow, inevitable decline. But no one ever saw a nurse, a prescription bottle, or a physical therapist. Come by point one afternoon, Sandra saw Marianne through the window of her house. She was standing motionless in the kitchen, staring blankly at a pot on the stove. Sandra knocked, but Marianne didn't respond. When Douglas came to the door moments later, he looked flustered. He said Marianne had been napping and thanked Sandra for checking in. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. 2 weeks later, tragedy struck. Douglas called 911 early in the morning. He said he had found Marianne in the bathtub, fully clothed, with her head underwater. The call was calm. The dispatcher noted his voice didn't crack, not once. When paramedics arrived, they found Marianne unresponsive, the water still warm, the wine bottle nearby untouched. Douglas said she had taken to drinking wine before her baths, a habit she'd picked up after her stroke. He said she must have slipped or lost consciousness. There was no evidence of a break-in or foul play. A faded bruise on her thigh was noted but dismissed. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, likely linked to her declining health. The community mourned. A short obituary ran in the paper, and the cremation happened quickly. Douglas skipped the traditional memorial and instead held a small lunch for a few close friends. People whispered, but no one asked questions outright. Everyone wanted to believe that Mary Ann had simply succumbed to poor health, to age, to misfortune. Only Sandra held on to her suspicions, watching as Douglas sold the house, closed accounts, and prepared to leave Augusta behind. No one knew it yet, but Mary Ann had left something behind. Something that would make sure her story wasn't finished. 3 weeks after Mary Ann's death, Douglas Whitmore stood in a bank lobby, holding a folder thick with paperwork. He wore a pressed navy blazer, a solemn expression, and a gold wedding ring that caught the light with every flick of his wrist. Inside the folder were the documents he believed would deliver him the final reward, a $1.7 million life insurance payout. He'd been careful. He'd double-checked dates, forged where necessary, and ensured no inconsistencies remained. The policy had been taken out in Mary Ann's name nearly 4 years earlier, but quietly adjusted just 1 year before her death, removing any secondary beneficiaries, naming only Douglas, and increasing the coverage under the justification of her fragile health. He submitted the claim confidently, assuming it would be processed within the month. But days passed, then a week, then 2, and no check arrived. Instead, Douglas received a polite but firm letter from the insurance company's fraud investigation unit. They were delaying payment due to concerns about potential discrepancies in the policy and requested additional medical records. Douglas clenched the paper so tightly it crinkled in his hands. His temper, once carefully controlled, began to show in flashes. He made several irate phone calls to the insurance office, threatening lawsuits, demanding supervisors. But the answer remained the same: pending review. What Douglas didn't know was that the policy had triggered an internal alert due to its size, the recent changes in beneficiaries, and the suddenness of Mary Ann's death. It was standard protocol, but the red flags multiplied when they reviewed her original signature against the updated paperwork. Subtle differences in her pen strokes, barely noticeable to the human eye, were flagged by signature recognition software at the same time. Another chain reaction had begun quietly in the background. Mary Ann's lawyer, Elise Gordon, received a small envelope in the mail 2 days after the obituary ran. It was labeled only with a note in Mary Ann's familiar script: to be opened if I die under unusual circumstances. Mary Ann had handed it to her 6 months earlier during a routine estate review. Elise had found it strange but respected her client's wishes. Now, with Mary Ann gone, she carefully opened the envelope and found a stack of handwritten pages, a printed spreadsheet, and a USB drive. Mary Ann had left more than memories. She had left a trail. The pages were neat, written in her careful cursive. Mary Ann described subtle but alarming changes in her health that she couldn't explain. She documented how Douglas insisted on preparing her meals, how she often felt groggy and confused after drinking tea or wine he poured for her. She wrote about a strange bitterness in her food. At first, she thought she was imagining things. But then she started recording what she ate and how she felt afterward. Her symptoms, dizziness, disorientation, stomach cramps, seemed to follow a pattern. She started skipping meals when Douglas wasn't looking and noticed improvement. The spreadsheet tracked unusual bank activity. Douglas had opened new credit cards in their name, taken out a loan against their retirement account, and initiated automatic transfers into an unknown account she couldn't access. Mary Ann had printed statements and even recorded the times when she caught Douglas snooping through her documents. Her notes were meticulous. She didn't accuse him outright, but she painted a clear picture of her growing fears. Then there was the USB drive. Elise plugged it into her laptop and found dozens of short video files. The timestamps showed Mary Ann had installed a motion sensor camera in the kitchen and another near her medicine cabinet. In several clips, Douglas was seen crushing pills into her tea or wine glass. He moved slowly, deliberately, always glancing over his shoulder. The image quality was grainy, the sound muffled, but the footage was damning. Marian had caught him. She just hadn't lived to see what it would prove, at least knew she had to act. She made copies of everything and sent them to the local authorities, including the district attorney's office. She also sent a letter to the insurance company, alerting them to a potential homicide investigation. Within days, Douglas's claim was frozen. Investigators reopened the case, this time not as an accidental drowning, but as a suspicious death with new evidence that needed to be examined. Douglas, unaware of the storm building behind him, continued to plan his new life. He'd already met with a realtor in Charleston, South Carolina, where he hoped to buy a waterfront condo. He told friends he wanted a fresh start after Marianne's passing. What he didn't know was that Marianne's quiet strength, her attention to detail, and her deep suspicion had planted the first seeds of his downfall. Her voice, preserved in notes and videos, had begun to speak louder than ever. Even in death, Douglas was still confident when detectives first knocked on his door. Wearing his usual composed expression, he welcomed them in with the poise of a man certain that he had covered his tracks. He offered tea, spoke calmly, and even pretended to be cooperative as they explained they were re-examining Marianne's death due to new information. Douglas played the part of the grieving husband to perfection, shaking his head in sorrow and recalling vague memories about Marianne's final months. He repeated the same narrative he'd given before, that her health had declined rapidly, that she'd become forgetful and unsteady, and that she had likely fallen asleep in the bath after drinking wine and taking her medication. But this time, the detectives weren't looking for his answers. They were watching how he reacted when confronted with inconsistencies. One investigator casually mentioned the insurance policy and how quickly he filed the claim. Another asked why no nurse or caregiver was ever brought in despite Marianne's alleged frailty. A third hinted at the toxicology analysis currently underway. Though subtle, Douglas's demeanor shifted. His answers grew shorter. His eyes narrowed. His control was beginning to fray. Meanwhile, the USB drive Marianne had left behind was undergoing forensic review. The footage, though low resolution, was authenticated by experts. The timestamps matched the windows when Douglas claimed to be running errands or working in his basement. In several clips, he could be seen holding a small pill crusher, emptying capsules into drinks, and stirring without hesitation. It wasn't a one-time act. It was a methodical routine. Investigators also enhanced the audio on one clip, catching the faint rattle of pills and the unmistakable fizz of dissolving powder. Detectives began piecing together the pattern. Marianne's sudden confusion, the unexplained bruises, the increased fatigue, they all aligned with long-term exposure to sedatives. They retrieved a hairbrush from her bathroom drawer that had been preserved with strands of her hair. Toxicology. Results confirmed chronic ingestion of diazepam, amitriptyline, and another mild hypnotic, none of which had ever been prescribed to her. The exposure timeline matched her notes and coincided perfectly with the periods of severe confusion she had described. More troubling still were the financial findings. The spreadsheet Marianne compiled revealed unauthorized withdrawals and opened the door to an even deeper financial investigation. Subpoenas were issued, and bank statements dating back 2 years showed multiple transfers to a secondary account in Douglas's name, one he hadn't disclosed. Investigators followed the money and discovered Douglas had been moving funds discreetly, using small withdrawals and hidden purchases. A luxury condo had been put on hold in Charleston. A separate bank account in the Cayman Islands showed a growing balance. The scope of the fraud became clear. Douglas had planned to eliminate Marianne, collect the $1.7 million insurance payout, and disappear into retirement under the guise of a grieving widower. He had manipulated the narrative to make her seem senile and unstable, forging her signature on policy updates and working with a former client, a pharmacist, to procure drugs without raising suspicion. That client, facing his own charges, quickly flipped and turned over dozens of text messages, some with instructions from Douglas on how to get the stuff that works fast but stays low. Back in Augusta, Sandra was called in for a formal statement. She spoke about Marianne's isolation, her disorientation, and Douglas's increasing control. She also confirmed that Marianne had confided in her once, vaguely mentioning that something felt off, though she never went into detail. Sandra handed over the greeting card Marianne had sent her a month before her death. It seemed innocent on the surface, but written inside was a cryptic note. If anything happens to me, please remember I wasn't clumsy. That sentence, once puzzling, now read like a plea. The district attorney's office moved swiftly. With the evidence mounting, digital, financial, toxicological, and testimonial, they issued an arrest warrant. Douglas was taken into custody without incident as he left a bank downtown. He didn't resist, but he didn't speak either. His silence was not out of dignity, but calculation. In his mind, there was still a chance to talk his way out of this, to spin a new version of the truth. What he hadn't counted on was the power of Marianne's preparation. Every note, every document, every piece of evidence she left behind had been crafted with patience and intention. She had seen the signs, trusted her instincts, and refused to leave her fate entirely in someone else's hands. Her quiet courage had turned the tide. And now, with the investigation expanding and the case building, Douglas's perfect plan was beginning to unravel, one hidden truth at a time. Douglas sat in the cold, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, his hands folded. Neatly in front of him, across the table, investigators laid out the evidence piece by piece. Forged signatures on policy documents, hidden financial transfers, unexplained medications traced back to a pharmacist who had already confessed. Douglas's face remained expressionless. He offered weak denials, calling the footage manipulated and the signatures a mistake. He claimed Marianne had been depressed, that she talked often about giving up, and that the medications were hers, left over from years before. But no matter how calmly he spoke, the mountain of proof around him kept growing taller, and he had nothing solid left to stand on. What Douglas didn't know was that investigators had already tracked down the digital footprints he left behind. IP addresses connected to policy modifications pointed directly to his home network. Emails between him and the complicit pharmacist referenced drug names in coded language that, when read with the context of the case, made their purpose painfully clear. Douglas had covered his tracks carefully, but he hadn't counted on Marianne, documenting everything. And he certainly hadn't expected the police to be so thorough in following every breadcrumb she had left. The case began to gain media attention. Local news outlets ran quiet stories about the former financial advisor accused of murdering his wife. The neighborhood where Douglas and Marianne had once lived was in disbelief. Friends who had once praised their long marriage now looked back at Douglas's odd behavior with unease. Sandra, who had kept her doubts to herself for so long, finally felt validated. She gave interviews, telling reporters how Marianne had slowly withdrawn from her life, and how Douglas always had a reason for keeping people at a distance. While the court-awaited trial, prosecutors worked methodically to build the case. They brought in toxicology experts who explained to the jury how long-term exposure to certain sedatives could mimic dementia or age-related decline. They detailed how Marianne's symptoms were consistent with cumulative drugging, subtle enough to go unnoticed at first, but strong enough to create confusion, drowsiness, and eventually, incapacitation. The footage from the kitchen camera, though grainy, showed Douglas administering something to her drinks on multiple occasions. It wasn't a single moment of weakness. It was a pattern, sustained and deliberate. The financial crimes were equally damning. The prosecutors revealed that Douglas had been draining their retirement funds, redirecting them into secret accounts, and preparing for a future without Marianne long before she died. He had even hired a real estate agent in another state and placed a deposit on a property in South Carolina. The insurance policy, worth $1.7 million, had been heavily altered just a year before Marianne's death, coinciding with the time she first began expressing concern about her health. Forensic handwriting analysts confirmed the signature on the change of beneficiary form was forged. Marianne's voice, preserved in her handwritten notes and carefully labeled files, was perhaps the most haunting piece of the case. In one letter to her attorney, she described waking up feeling off and wondering whether her husband was putting something in her food. She wrote that if she ever died suddenly, it wouldn't be an accident. Those words, written in her steady hand, carried a weight that no jury could ignore. She hadn't just suspected danger. She had tried to leave a roadmap behind that Douglas's defense attempted to discredit her. They said Marianne had suffered from post-stroke anxiety, that her paranoia led her to make wild assumptions, and that the notes were simply the writings of an aging woman losing her grip on reality. But that argument collapsed when cross-referenced. With the physical proof, the drug levels, the altered documents, the camera footage, and the testimony of the pharmacist who had helped Douglas obtain the medications illegally, the trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury took less than a day to deliberate. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts including first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and financial conspiracy, Douglas showed no visible reaction. He stood there, silent, as if still, convinced he could control what happened next. But control had left him the moment Marianne decided to take action. The sentencing came swiftly. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Douglas would spend the rest of his life behind bars, stripped of his carefully constructed image, outsmarted by the very woman he thought was too weak to fight back. Outside the courthouse, Sandra held back tears as she spoke to reporters. She said Marianne had always been gentle, quiet, and kind, but never naive. She knew something was wrong, and instead of panicking, she prepared. She built her case slowly, methodically, and trusted that someone would eventually listen. And someone did. Douglas Whitmore entered the prison system not as a misunderstood man or even a remorseful one, but as a convicted murderer whose carefully orchestrated plan had fallen apart because of one thing he never anticipated: his wife's quiet brilliance. His cell was cold, gray, and stripped of the polished world he once controlled. The man who used to manipulate finances, forge documents, and poison tea now stood in line for bland meals and folded laundry for cents a day. There were no more tailored suits or retirement dreams. There were only long hours and the growing realization that Marianne had defeated him long before a jury did. But in Augusta, Marianne's story refused to fade. Her friends, particularly Sandra, took it upon themselves to make sure her name wasn't just attached to a tragedy, but remembered. For her courage, word of her meticulous planning, and the evidence she collected became a symbol of quiet resistance. For months, local women's groups and legal advocates spoke her name in conversations about elder abuse and financial manipulation within marriages. Her story was more than just a case. It became a warning, a lesson, and a tribute point. One of the most remarkable aspects of her story was how deliberately she had laid the groundwork. Marianne had no background in law enforcement or investigative work, yet her instincts guided her to document everything with care. She dated her notes, labeled bank printouts, and backed up digital files on more than one device. She had even hidden a second copy of her evidence folder inside an old cookbook in the attic, a folder discovered weeks after Douglas's arrest, confirming everything she had already revealed. That it turned out that Marianne had once suspected she wouldn't live long enough to hand her evidence over in person. In one of her last entries, She wrote that she didn't know if she'd be believed, but she had to try. She described waking up every day pretending not to notice the bitter taste in her tea or the dullness that followed after dinner. She forced herself to act as though everything was normal while cataloging every abnormal moment. Her quiet patience wasn't just survival, it was strategy. The attorney, Elise Gordon, who had acted as the executor of Marianne's estate, said publicly that she had never seen a client prepare so thoroughly under such subtle threat. Most people under that kind of pressure either ignore the signs or grow too fearful to act. Marianne had done neither. She had trusted her instincts, trusted the paper trail, and trusted someone would connect the dots after she was gone. The life insurance policy Douglas had tried so desperately to cash was frozen permanently. The $1.7 million was never paid to him. After his conviction, the money was redirected into a victim's restitution fund, following Marianne's own instructions, laid out in her final will. A portion of the funds was donated to local domestic violence shelters, and another part was granted to a legal aid program helping elderly individuals facing financial exploitation. Even in death, Marianne's impact continued to ripple outward. Douglas, now nearing the end of his life, sits alone in a prison infirmary most days. His name rarely appears in the news anymore. He receives no visitors and answers no letters. Occasionally, he files appeals, hoping to find some legal thread to pull, but every motion is swiftly denied. The evidence remains too solid, the verdict too final. His world, once filled with control, is now reduced to silence. Back in Augusta, the house where Marianne lived is now owned by a young couple who've restored the garden she once loved. The roses bloom again each spring, their colors bright and defiant against the memory of what took place behind those walls. Sandra still visits occasionally, standing at the gate with a soft smile, remembering her friend not for how she died, but for the courage she showed in her final days. Marianne Whitmore did not go quietly. Though frail in body, she stood firm. In spirit, using the only tools she had: pen, paper, observation, and will. She uncovered a betrayal she didn't want to believe, documented the truth she knew would be buried, and built a case that would echo far beyond her lifetime. But in the end, she wasn't the victim of a perfect crime. She was the author of its unraveling.